My name is Jonathan Withy, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology. This week represents Research and Scholarship Days across Mount Royal University. It's an annual event that is designed to both showcase and celebrate research at the institution. I want to congratulate all of the students who are presenting as part of Research and Scholarship Days this week, and in particular at the Faculty of Science and Technology event tomorrow. Thank you for stepping forward to become directly engaged in research, and congratulations on your success and achievements. But you're not here to listen to me today, rather to our guest, Dr. Court Sandau. Fortunately, there's a great deal of serendipity in science, as Court began his career as a chemist almost by accident. Under the direction of his university entrance advisor, he made an impulsive, although some might say wise, decision to switch his undergraduate degree from French literature to the chemistry program offered at the University of Western Ontario. In a tenuous connection of my own creation, it was French scientist Louis Pasteur who famously said, "Chance favors only the prepared mind." Following graduation with a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemistry and Environmental Science, Court went on to pursue a doctoral degree in chemistry at Carleton University. Since then, Court has held a variety of senior positions with environmental and disease prevention organizations and is currently the president and owner of Chemistry Matters, a niche environmental consulting firm which specializes in geoforensics, environmental forensics, biomonitoring, and arson investigations. As an international speaker and expert chemist, Court is often called upon to provide his services in oil and gas investigations and litigious chemistry issues. Court serves as an expert chemist throughout all steps of an investigation, from the field, through the laboratory, and into the courtroom. In doing so, he helps solve some of the most complex legal disputes which have chemistry as an expert witness. Born and raised in Calgary, Court has become an international expert in environmental chemistry. He has inspired the chemistry community to view science in new ways through his keynote talks and conference lectures delivered all over the world. Today we get to benefit from one such keynote, Arson, the science of fire and chemical fingerprints left behind. Currently, he provides legal sampling, consulting, and data interpretation services, as well as expert legal testimony related to arson investigations. As part of these investigations, Court is expanding knowledge in the area of chemical fingerprinting of ignitable liquid residues for the purpose of aiding arson investigations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Court Sandau to the stage.
For a lot of that, I was wondering who he was talking about. Thank you for that amazing introduction. And a few of my slides have now been taken away, but that's okay. We can get to some of the good, cool science stuff that I wanted to talk to you about. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody. Sorry, this is in my way. I can't see everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, faculty and staff, and especially the students. Thanks for taking the time. I know you guys have a lot of assignments due. End of the year's coming tick, tick. So, hopefully you enjoy this talk, and I'm allowed to enlighten you for an hour that I get with you today. So today we're going to talk about arson and arson investigations and some of the things that I'm doing both scientifically to study arson and how we can use those for the cases that I'm working on. I wanted to give a little bit of background, which was succinctly summarized already, that I wasn't planning on being a chemist when I was going away to school. I was following my girlfriend to take French literature with her at University of Western Ontario. She was a lovely lady. She's sitting in the back. She ended up being my wife. But thank goodness that that guidance counselor called me. It was about a month. I remember the phone call. It was about a month before I'm going to pack up my car and drive across the country to go to the University of Western Ontario. And the guidance counselor calls me. He goes, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "What?" He says, "Your chemistry mark's really good. Your French mark is not. You should take chemistry." And that forever changed my fate. I'm glad I was able to make a quick decision and go that direction. So I'm actually born and raised in Calgary. Apparently there's not too many of us, but I am one of them. I went to school in Cochrane. Don't hold that against me, but that's where my wife and I were born and raised, where I met her in grade 1 and was proceeding to follow her to university. So French literature turned into science. thank goodness. I don't know what I'd be doing with a French literature degree right now, but I know I sure like my degree or my employment right now as a chemist. So I started off in chemistry and environmental science at the University of Western Ontario, finished an undergrad, and was trying to figure out what the heck I'm going to do with an undergrad in chemistry. So to delay that decision, I decided to take more school, which I think is a common thing. And I found a supervisor at Carleton University who was working on polar bears. That seemed pretty sexy at the time, to go sample polar bears and get their blood and analyze them for contaminants. So I proceeded to go for 5 more years of school at Carleton. Again, I find a mentor. As we were saying before, one of the biggest things were my mentors along the way, and my thesis supervisor was a good mentor. He allowed me to travel the world and present at conferences. That allowed me to network and find people that had common interests. I decided to talk to people at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and right after my PhD, they recruited me down to Atlanta to work at the CDC, which, how do you turn that job down after coming out of a PhD? So I went down there and worked for 4 years, working on chemical warfare agents and such, and PEHs. And I showed some pictures here just to give you a little bit of an idea of how do you become an analytical chemist in forensics. It's not really a straight road. First I was going to be French literature, then I was into environmental science, going to save the world, had that sort of aspect. But I quickly learned the science of analytical chemistry and fell in love with it. How do you measure stuff? How much can you measure? What are all the things that we can find? Do they have adverse effects? And it just fascinated me to the study of analytical chemistry and the application of it. So I was able to sample polar bears. And in the top corner, we'd take their blood. It was a typical, I call it an alien abduction. If you can imagine the poor polar bear is walking along the tundra, minding his own business, and all of a sudden he hears there's a helicopter coming, right? Tuk, 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 tuk. And he just starts looking around. You can see the panic. He starts tearing across the Arctic, trying to run away from this helicopter. Humans with guns hanging out the window, shoot him, dart him. He's still awake, or she. We weren't biased that way. Flat out on the Arctic thing, they get the shot in the butt, they fall asleep, but they can still see and hear everything. We had to cover up their faces because they would start to overheat if they sat there and watched you as we took samples. And then, now you're taking samples from every orifice in their body, so it's the typical alien abduction, right? To getting poked and prodded and weighed, and all the time while they're awake, right? And then we'd give them the last person, usually the lowest on the totem pole, had to give the antidote, hop back on the helicopter, and get the heck out of there, because usually they'd get up and they were quite ticked. But that was the polar bear sampling program. We did bald eagles as well. I did a little bit of work on humans and Inuits and looking at their exposure, and that's sort of what got me down to the Centers for Disease Control. That was a fortuitous place to work, obviously, quite high standards. You get to learn a lot. 9/11 happened when I was down there, which, not a good thing, but we got super funded as an organization. Our budget went from 40 million to 200 million to 400 million. I had every chemistry toy I could put and squeeze into my little room. So it was extremely fun to learn all the different things we could do and all the little instrumentations we could use. And I'm still applying that knowledge today for my forensics. Started to have kids in Atlanta and decided that I wanted to move home, be closer to family, and in 2004 I moved back to Calgary and worked for an environmental consulting firm for about 18 months before opening my own business, and that's where I started my own work and doing my own niche consulting, specializing in environmental forensics. So that's how I got from A to B. It wasn't really a straight trail, but it was a fun one. I realized though, when I was in high school, I was a jock. I was on the hockey team. I was on the football team. I was pretty proud of myself. I was cool. I was in the cool group. My wife wasn't in the cool group, but I still managed to date her. I was that good. Went away and took chemistry for 4 years and started to realize I was a nerd. I don't know how that happened. It's just 4 years later, I went in a jock, I came out a nerd, and I was like, what the heck is going on? So I've been struggling ever since to try to get sexiness back into my work and to feel good about the work I do. So one of the things, the CSI has been a big thing for me. Everybody's watching these shows, right? How do we, can we relate to CSI? So I made my own for environmental forensics for the work we do, not quite as glamorous, not quite the bright lights. We're sampling dirt and vacuuming things in people's, living rooms and stuff. But that was our sort of sexy. fancy as having this environmental forensics investigation. So what do I actually do? So for arson, we're going to talk specifically about arson today. I do a bunch of other stuff. Anything chemistry, niche chemistry, fingerprinting, isotope analysis, using pattern recognition in contaminants or in isotopes to determine where the source of contaminants are coming from. Anything like that we work on. But for arson, in particular, which is what this talks about, I provide the scientific support for an arson investigation. There's people that do arson investigations routinely. I'm the science guy that they, phone a friend when they have a question. Does this make sense? What about this? I do full service, so on really litigious cases, sometimes it's good to have the guy that's going to testify about stuff go out to the field and take the samples, because then there's one guy to call up, and he can talk about the whole process, what you did in the field, what you did in the lab, and what the interpretation is, and that just sort of unifies it through one person. So we collect these samples in a defensible manner. It is legal. A lot of these arsons obviously cost a lot of money. You've seen some of the arson cases around Alberta. They're large dollar cases, and when they do go to court, it's going to be an expensive bill. So we have to take those samples with extreme caution, making sure we're preserving them right. Everything's done to the book. So I do that in the field. We analyze those samples. Analyze, it seems like an easy word, and we'll talk a little bit about the complexities of analyzing arson samples. We interpret the data, basically saying, is there an accelerant present? It can be any accelerant. It can be gasoline, diesel, kerosene, it can be methanol, acetone. All of these can be used to start fires deliberately, chemistry-wise, and those are the ones that we're looking for to be able to identify in the field, in the data when we get it back. And then ultimately testifying in a courtroom. I look like that sometimes, like when the lawyers are asking you questions, you'd be surprised how lawyers have no idea about the science, can ask you questions and stump you, and you're just sort of, what? Can I have some water? Even up to that. And I actually quite enjoy that. It's sort of a battle of wits to be able to figure out what they're really asking you, because a lot of the time it's not really what you think they're asking you, or that they're asking you, if you can imagine that. So, full service from field to the courtroom. So we talk about wildfires. I had to look this up. I get cases come in on a weekly basis, but there's over 1,200 wildfires in Alberta every year. Who knew? That's a big number. A lot of them are in very secluded areas, and they're lightning strikes. 47% of all wildfires in Alberta are lightning strikes. There are over 50% are human caused, whether it's an accident or intentional. That's the tough part, is trying to prove whether it was a campfire that was left unattended or if it was someone playing with fire and trying to start a fire deliberately, and whether they're starting that deliberately to cause damage, which is the definition of arson. But our job is to investigate those. I take samples in, and we basically check for these accelerants, which are the things that were used to start the fire, and then we confirm whether their presence or absence and pass that information on to the people that are going to do the investigation more to arrest the individuals that may be responsible. The big thing is where do you start? You're walking out into the middle of a forest, and this is kind of what you're seeing, is just sort of black, desolate. And that's not where I get involved, because I look at this and it's a burnt forest. I wouldn't know where to start at this point. And that's why we have fire investigators. And there's Alberta has some of the best fire investigators in the world that can read fires. And I call them these that read the grass. They'll basically go out to where an ignition point is. We have a lot of watchtowers across Alberta where there's people sitting in them 24/7 looking for the start of a fire. When they see one, they call it in. Helicopters will head out, and they'll be at the area of origin of a fire, within an hour or two after it starts. So we have quite quick response all across Alberta. They'll send in these investigators who will go into the fire when it's safe, obviously, and they'll look at the lay of the land and look at where the fire started and read the grass. They can tell when the fire went the wrong way because it was going with accelerant, not with the wind. The wind is blowing fires this way, and most of the grass is moving that way and gets burnt and lays down that way. But when you're putting accelerant down, it sort of burns the opposite direction. So they're looking for these weird markings. The little weird markings, like on this log here, you can see it's scarred in the middle, this big black spot. That's not natural. The fire didn't come over there and just sort of lick the log and then take off. Someone has put accelerant across that log and used that as a starting point for that fire. And so they're looking for this. And they're amazing. They can look at these burn patterns and see them, and they sort of start to build a case. As soon as they see weird bird patterns, they start to get little hairs on the back of their neck start to go up, and they go, okay, we've got something here. We've got to investigate it a little further. But, that one's a little easy. You can see a burnt log. Obviously, if we were to take a sample, we're probably going to sample where it's burnt. That's an easy one. But there's a lot of the time where it's an open field, and it could be anywhere. And so sometimes we have to get the help of dogs. And this is a canine. Her name's Joby, and she's indicating where she is smelling accelerant. She's been trained specifically to find 50% evaporated gasoline. She can actually find any accelerant, kerosene, diesel, petroleum even. She's hit on cadaver dogs. She's sort of self-trained herself to find cadavers at one point. She does house fires and wildfires, but quite phenomenal. She'll go and she'll walk into an area, and the trainer just sort of walks along, and she'll stop, and she's trained by food reward, so her mouth just starts salivating. As soon as she smells gasoline, her mouth is salivating, she's dripping, right? She's like, oh, time to eat, and she gets quite excited. And so they'll walk her around an investigation area, and we'll put little flags in wherever Joby says. And she's good. These the accelerant canine or detection canines, ADCs, they have an excellent capability to detect these. They get trained and certified every year. They fly to Maryland and have to get certified in an international venue to be able to do this on a regular basis. That's how they sort of keep up to date. Every day they're training. They don't get fed unless they train, so they're training twice a day basically for their accelerants. Their detection limits are better than any field deployable equipment we've got. There's nothing electronic that we can do that's better than a dog. And I just put some general sensitivities here, like that's just to give you an idea. Canine is about parts per trillion level of accelerant they can detect in a sample, which is incredible. Humans, really smelly compounds, we can smell at about a part per billion. Sulfur compounds, rotten egg smell, H2S, those are the things that we can smell at very low levels at parts per billion, but that's still, the dog's still 1,000-fold better than that. And our lab is really parts per million to parts per billion for detection limits on a routine basis, routine laboratory analysis. So as you can see, those dogs are quite capable of sensing stuff. And I had to look this up because a lot of the fire investigators I work with, and they don't believe that these dogs can do what they can do. So I have to actually defend the dogs, believe it or not, even though they're better sensors than my lab. We have to defend how we find accelerant. So looking it up, a dog actually has a specialized olfactory area in their nose, and 12% of all the air that they're breathing in, they send to that area, and they can control that amount of air. They can change it. So the other 88% goes to their breathing, 12% they're going to sensory and trying to figure out what the smell that they're seeing. But there's an area over here where it's passing through, and it's this long passage, and they can expand and contract that to get as much contact time as they need to be able to get the smells that they're looking for. So they can control their detection limits. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to do that in the lab? Hey, I just need to detect a little bit more. I'm just going to amplify it. And they're doing it all on the run. A human has a olfactory bulb that's about the size of a quarter. And when we breathe in, all our air goes zipping by it like in a second, right? So you can see why we can't detect the same things they can. They're able to, they have over 300 million olfactory receptors. Humans only have about 6 million. They can control how much air is going in that area, and then they can expand and contract it to depend on how much time they want that scent to stay there. And each of these, they've built receptors, and when you train your dog for an accelerant, they've trained their receptors to be hyperactive towards certain smells. So not only do they have this capability, we've also amplified and made them super smellers, right, for those particular smells that we want them to find. So they're incredible at finding those target compounds, and they can smell very low levels. And there's a lot of the time where Joby will indicate on a sample, and the lab, it's just like, yeah, we got nothing. And Joby says it is, and we say it isn't. And believe it or not, the courtrooms and the court systems, the investigators, they believe me as the chemist a little bit more than Joby. But I think we just haven't got there for the detection limits to be able to support Joby in what she's smelling. So once Joby's done her thing, so we take a random area in the middle of a forest that has burn marks that we got to figure out where to sample. There's me thinking about where to sample, getting all dirty. Joby does her thing. We put flags in the ground. Then we'll go sample those flags. So now we're sampling soils. We're taking an environmental sample. It's just like a normal environmental sampling, and we put it in these paint cans. This is one of my critiques of the arson investigation is I've done environmental work all around the world, and we have these specialized glass-sealed vials that we buy specially from EPA. They're certified to be clean. You can't have the seal broken. You can't use them, and they're super designed, and we spend lots of money on them. And arson investigations, they go to their local paint store, grab paint cans, and throw it in the back of the truck and go collect forensic data, right? Drives me nuts. How can they do that? But I'm going to try to break that mold, and I'm working on it. I've given a talk in Vegas in a couple weeks there. I get to attack how they do their work, so that should go over well. They take change very nicely. But here I am with paint cans. We've specially treated these paint cans. We purchase them. We burn them off in the lab to remove any cross-contamination. When they're making paint cans, they need lubricants, and those lubricants can get into the cans, so you can get hydrocarbons in these cans if you're not too careful. So we burn those off, and we'll take them out to the field clean, so we pre-clean them, and so that's what evidence is collected in. We then take those to the lab, and we do an extraction on them. And we end up with this little vial, which we were going to run in the mass spec. So my next storyboard here. When we're out there, we have to document it like it's a legal case. So we're literally with, part of my job is cameraman. We usually have multiple people out there. It's not a one-person job, but we'll go out to the road where the fire is, and maybe it's usually easy for the arsonist. It's not like they hike 100 kilometers into the forest and start a fire. Like, that would be kind of crazy, right? You could get stuck and die. But usually they're driving down leased roads, finding nice hidden areas where they can get out quick. So we'll walk to the main road, take pictures, document the scene, walk into the area where Joby's indicated, take pictures of the location that we're going to sample, what it looks like. We will then mark it with flags. And then we sample each location. We videotape ourselves sampling, because again, if anybody questions, Dr. Sandau, what did you do in the field? Well, here's 12 hours of exciting sampling video that you can watch to fill your boots, right? It'll be fun to watch. Exciting television. But we document everything again just to have that proof. So there's beyond a reasonable doubt. We don't want to have any doubt, and I want them to question the actual interpretation, not how I sampled dirt. So we'll go in the field, collect those samples, send them to the lab, and ultimately they end up in these little cans, and they're legally sealed, and that goes to the laboratory for analysis. So I'm going to gloss over this a little bit, but now we have to get the sample, which is on this wood, dirt, bark, in a can, and we got to get it into the mass spec so that we can see if there's accelerant present or not. So there's a little bit to do here, right? It's not too easy. That's the can that we sample in the top left. We use a thing called a carbon strip, so we clean these carbon. Carbon is a great absorbent. Anything organic likes to stick to carbon. So we use that. We clean the carbon so there's nothing on it. We put it in the can with the debris. Here's sort of a cartoon of what it's supposed to look like. And we put it in an oven for about 80 degrees, 100 degrees for about 16 hours. And what that does is these are our accelerant molecules, nice colors sitting inside on my debris. Those are the things we want to get. We heat it up, and they all pop up, and they go into the headspace. Okay? The carbon strip that's hanging there is like a magnet. Anything organic wants to hop onto that carbon strip and hang out. So all the molecules, they jump up, they stick to our carbon strip, and then we put that carbon strip in a little vial of carbon disulfide. That pulls everything off of it, and we run it on the mass spec. And that's the magical CSI moment where they put it in the instrument, and a second later you get the results. That's kind of what we do. Not quite that easy, though. So now the data comes out of the mass spec, and the GC, it's a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, and we look for peaks. And these are the fun chemistry things I get to look for on a daily basis. These are the peaks of gasoline. And they have complicated names, and the names are up here if you want to try to pronounce them: 2-methylnaphthalene and 3-ethyltoluene, and all these funky names. Fire investigators in the 80s thought it would be cool to give them weird names like the Three Musketeers and the Castle Group. The Castle Group's supposed to look like the Disney Castle. Apparently he was taking some vacations in Los Angeles, so that's supposed to be the Disney Castle there. The Gang of Four, which is actually 8 compounds, but at the time they could only identify 4, so they called it the Gang of Four, the Twin Towers. And basically, when we get our data out, we're looking for these patterns. because this tells us that gasoline's been used. Kerosene has some of these compounds. It doesn't have the light ones, but it does have the heavier ones. Diesel doesn't have the first two groups, but it has the next three. So these are the common things that you find in a distilled petroleum product that we look for, and we look for the presence of these compounds in the sample. And that's pretty much the routine analysis that we do in arson. All arson labs, that's what they do. And it's really, I call this back in the 80s, because I remember when I was, 80s, 90s, when I was doing my PhD research, I was still holding up chromatograms against a window to compare retention times to make sure everything's there. And we're in the computer age now where we shouldn't really have to be looking against a window to see if stuff's matching. But that's still how we do arson analysis on a routine basis, is we're looking at the chromatogram, squinting at it and going, yeah, no. And that's the yes or no of arson investigation, and that's something that I hope to change, and hopefully my talk shows you what I'm doing. Because gasoline, when you're dealing with no matrix, is pretty easy. Here's my Three Musketeers. Here's my castle group. You can see the Disney castle there. Here's my gang of four with 4 peaks sticking up. Very easy to see when there's no matrix, right? That's dead simple. Put it on gravel, I'm not shaking up the instrument too much. There's not too much organic material on gravel to cause me not to be able to see gasoline, so that's pretty easy. Put it on burnt wood and glass, you start to see these other compounds start to sneak into the chromatogram. And these are not gasoline, but they cause a visual distortion of that pattern to be able to say if it's there or not. That's not too bad. And it depends on how much gasoline's in the sample. But you go to something like vegetation, wildfires, it's all vegetation. That's the kind of stuff I see. So, okay, my Three Musketeers are here, but can anybody see the castle group anymore? Like, it's hidden behind all these other organic molecules. A real moment came when I did my first wildfire analysis and went, uh-oh, I can't see anything anymore because I have natural compounds that are interfering in my peak detection. Now, that's not good. How am I supposed to say if there's gasoline present or not if I've got a bunch of stuff in front of them that's interfering? And so it becomes a little bit difficult. And here's some of the compounds. These are natural compounds: pinene, limonene, sec-butylbenzene, these camphene molecules. They're all the natural materials that are in forests. Broken down logs, grass, soil. They all contain these to very high concentrations, percent quantity per levels, right? I'm looking at leaf litter and wood. They contain percent amounts of these, not parts per billion, which is what I'm going for. So I have this analytical issue of I can't see the molecules that I need to identify whether there's accelerant present or not. So again, I said we were back in the 80s in arson investigations, and I really meant that. So I want to talk a little bit about what we do in analytical chemistry now. I worked at CDC. There's been 20 years of analytical development since they were looking at patterns and looking against the window like that. What can we do? How low can we go? What's the analytical chemistry like? And right now we're in the golden age of analytical chemistry. We have so many instruments that can see such little amounts of material. It's amazing. So I wanted to sort of give you a picture of where we can go with analytical chemistry. How complicated do you think it can get? You add gasoline, you add it to a forest, you burn it, so it forms a whole bunch of other products when you burn it, and then you put it into one vial and try to run it. Like how, that sounds like it's starting to get to be a lot of different things that could be in that sample. It's not so easy. So I put a little chart together just to give people an idea of number of compounds that you find in common things. So atmospheric aerosol, when you're walking through that pine forest, how many compounds do you think you're smelling as you're walking through the forest? Any idea? 50? Make sense? About 50 different things are hitting your nose and making you breathe in deeply and relax as you're smelling the pine forest. It's great. Roasted coffee, everybody likes that. How many compounds do you think are in the aromatic fraction of roasted coffee? That smells great too, all the caramel flavors and vanilla. I can never describe it like that. I'm not good at that at all. But there's about 1,000 different compounds in roasted coffee. And that's because we've partially burned it. So there's other compounds, and then we've partially burned them to make a bunch of other different things. So that's why there's so many of the darn things in coffee and why it smells so nice. Cigarette smoke, 6,000. Everybody knows that. Cigarette smoke, bad for you. Lots of bad things in there. Gasoline. How many compounds are in gasoline? So now it's a quiz time. Show of hands. I'm not even going to remember. I can't even see you really because the lights are blinding. But how many people think less than 50? couple, okay, 50 to 100. Couple more, 300 to 500. Okay, that's a little bit more than that. How about 500 to 1,000? About the same as C. Answer C. You go to the pump and buy gasoline from Shell, Esso, whatever. There's about 300 to 500 different things in that formulation. Who knew, right? I thought it was just octane, but it's a bunch of stuff. And depending on proprietary blends, they add different additives. They have different distillation products. Shell has a very solid formulation it always looks the same. Esso, you can buy it from a bunch of different places. Petrocan, they're pretty consistent in their production. And then they all add different blends depending on how cold it is, summer, winter. We have different things. But about 300 to 500 different things are in your normal gasoline that we're adding to burn something. So we have to be able to detect at least 300 to 500 things in our analysis. So let's see, and to sufficient detection limits. So thousands of compounds. Gasoline, and then you have those other natural materials, and then we burn it, we get thousands of compounds. So what I did is a quick burn test to try to figure this out. I'll show a video in a second. So I took wood chips. That's natural, right? Went to the local wood chip selling place, made sure there wasn't any accelerants in the blank, which is good experimental protocol. You got to make sure you got a clean blank before you start experimenting. And then we burnt wood chips to different degrees. We burnt it to 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 120 seconds, 240 seconds, burning wood chips, spiking gasoline to those wood chips, and then burning them to see how much of the gasoline was left after we burned it, to see how good our detection limits were and what kind of instrumentation we needed. We used about 70 grams of wood chips. That was about right to half fill a can, which is really the only thing that I was using for 70 grams. And then we had to spike with gasoline so we could get in our linear range. So gasoline, we have to spike gasoline onto 70 grams of wood chips. I just wanted to give an idea so people could get an amount. What is microliter? We talk about microliters and people just kind of go, I'm down in the States, I have to put it in ounces because they don't know microliters. And so I 0.003 ounces or 100 microliters. A, B, C, D, or E. Or there's no E, don't pick E. But if you pick E, never mind. A, B, C, or D, which is 100 microliters? How many people say A? B? C? D. Ooh. It's a bit of a trick question. It's actually B. But it's a very small amount. So that's 100 microliters, about the size of an American dime, just a little bit. That's 25 microliters, so that's a quarter of that. So I have to spike these wood chips so that I can see how much I can see. So I wanted to get my detection limit instrumentation. I wanted to get my linear range of my instrument. So I had to take 25 microliters. But not only that, I couldn't put 25 microliters on my wood chips. I had to take a fifth of that, 5 microliters. So that little triangle represents how much gasoline I put on those 70 grams of wood chips before burning it. So it's not very much. And I got to do this in my garage over and over again. The floor was cleanly swept, so it kept it nice and clean. Had my pit mitt on for safety, because believe it or not, it took me a couple times. That thing does get hot, stainless steel bowl flame. Who knew? Heating it for 240 seconds, which is a long time. That bowl can get quite hot. But with the blowtorch, just going and scorching the heck out of those wood chips to see if I can see the gasoline. So recapping, 70 grams of wood chips, spiking it with that 5 microliters of pure gasoline, burning it for varying degrees. Let's see how much we can see. That was like a 2-minute video on a blowtorch burning wood chips, so not that exciting. And here's a plot of the burn time versus the amount of gasoline that was remaining in the sample. And pretty much, if I do a linear extrapolation to where the curve, it drops off automatically, obviously quite quick. It drops off, and then it sort of is a steady decline. Within about 6 minutes, we predict, using the extrapolation, that about 0.1% of that 5 microliters of gasoline is present. And we're detecting it with our detector. So that's pretty good. Just to do the math for you, that's 0.005 microliters of gasoline we can detect on one of those samples. That seems pretty good, right? So when we burn stuff, we lose, obviously, a lot of the signal that we're trying to find in the first place. So I wanted to see the detection limits and show you where the detection limits are in industry. And I had to do this. Analytical chemistry has been driven a lot from external reasons, and one of the reasons we got such low detection limits is the search for dioxin. Dioxin is a contaminant. It was produced inadvertently with a number of processes, highly toxic, and caused a couple of pretty bad accidents. And we had to figure out how to detect it to really low concentrations because it had such extreme toxicity. So we wanted to see how low we could go with dioxin. And at CDC is where they got it to as low as they could possibly get. And I'm also going to look at complex mixtures and how complex we can handle stuff. So it was my colleagues at CDC, Jeff Faucant, Don Patterson, and Wayman Turner, who used a bunch of tricks. They used a high-res mass spectrometer, which is the most sensitive instrumentation they could get, and they used some tricks to cryo-focus things and get it. But pretty much they can see attogram quantities of dioxin. So this is cryo-focusing. That's 540 attograms. Wow, eh? Everybody's like, what? 500? What's 540 attograms? I had to look it up too. It's 10 to the minus 18. It's equivalent to zeptomoles, or part per quintillion. 480 parts per quintillion. You do Avogadro's number to figure it out. We can detect 2,000 molecules. That's incredible. At this point, we can pretty much see any chemical in about any environmental matrix with these kind of detection limits. We don't have very much further to go, including, a couple 6 orders of magnitude. We can go into these phantom moles where we're detecting parts of a mole of compounds. It's incredible how low we can go and see. So we shouldn't be limited by detection limits. So when they're measuring stuff in the environment and they say, we didn't see any PAHs or we didn't see any PCBs, you just weren't looking hard enough because we could see everything if you wanted to. They've just set a cutoff to say we're not going to look any further than that. And to put that in perspective of what an attogram is, Jeff Faucant, he presented this at, where was it? It was in the 2DGC conference I went to at the beginning of the year. He put it in perspective. So the distance between the moon and the Earth is about 384,000 kilometers. It's the equivalent of seeing one buckyball, which is 1 nanometer in length between the moon and the Earth. If that helps you. Some people like time. To put it in perspective of time, a part per quadrillion is like measuring 1 second in 1 times 10 to the 15 seconds, or 1 second in 32 million years. That's pretty low. We can't get much better than that. They're trying. They're probably going to get another order of magnitude or 2. But that's probably as low as we're going to go because we're down to the molecules. We can see molecule amounts of things. So our detection limit should never be an issue. So the next thing is to deal with the complexity of a sample. Crude oil is pretty complex. It's got 10, 15,000 different things in it. This is a technique that I've been using since I was at CDC, and I've been constantly pushing for my arson investigations because we needed it. It's called 2DGC mass spectrometry. We use time-of-flight mass spectrometry. It's where we not only use one dimension of chromatography, but we use a second dimension of chromatography. Using a modulator, we can then cut the 1D and send it into a second dimension, and it builds a chromatogram that's sort of a 3-dimensional plot. It pulls peaks out of the one-dimensional chromatogram. We can do a contour plot where we can look down at that and see all the different compounds that are present. So this is like you're going hiking and these mountains coming up at you, sort of a contour plot. We can then put it in 3D. And everybody calls this the useless part of a 2DGC time-of-flight mass spec, but I love it because it's so visual, so easy to see stuff there. And it's incredible for communicating science to a courtroom or to a judge to be able to fly into one of these things. You can imagine just flying in and saying, hey, here's your magical peak that's causing all the problems. I find these extremely powerful. So this technique is actually 4 dimensions. I was waiting for like a wow. No? 4D, man. Chemistry, 4D. Who knew? First dimension is separating things along that one gas chromatograph column. We then use a second dimension, which is only measured in seconds. That's like 6,500 seconds. This is 4 seconds. So it's just a fast separation. We then have the amplitude of the compounds. The bigger they are, the bigger amplitude they have, they start to get red. That tells us that they're more concentrated in that sample. So we're getting a third piece of information on this sample, or on this particular compound, because we know how much is present. And then we can click on that and get basically the DNA of it. That's the full scan mass spectra of that sample, or of that particular compound. So now we have basically the DNA makeup of it. We can put it to a library and say, hey, library, what is that? And that's limonene, I think. Is it limonene? Pinene. So that's pinene. And the library is saying, hey, this is pinene that you're seeing here. So incredible 4D results. So we have to go into multiple dimensions just to even measure this stuff. And so for crude oil, they've done this a lot. It's an incredible thing to deal with that huge, complex number of compounds. We can separate them all out and identify all 15, 20,000 chemicals in crude oil if we wanted. This is diesel, a local diesel station that we ran, where you can see 1D chromatogram is that big humpogram on the right. Doesn't really tell you too much, whereas in 3 dimensions, we can see all the individual peaks that make up the mixture of that particular diesel. So incredible fingerprinting technique that you can use with the chemistry that's currently available. So I wanted to apply this to arson. And we needed some big cases to do that, because I'm looking for that castle group over there to say whether there's gas present or not. And I'm looking for the Disney castle. Mickey Mouse is trying to wave at me. And I'm looking here, and I can't really see it. There's no castle group there. That's positive for accelerant, but there's no castle group. And I've got a problem. I've got this great big thing that's in my chromatogram. And you can see there's 2 million counts, which tells me that there's a huge response there. There's a lot of stuff there, but I can't see my gasoline peaks, my castle group. And when I ran that on 2D, lo and behold, I was able to pull that interference off and away from the compounds of interest. And so this is the big humpogram that you saw there is a mixture of this unknown compound. We have stereoisomers of camphene, which is the natural molecules that are present in the forest. Verbene, which is another natural one. We have alpha-pinene over there. There's another isomer of alpha-pinene over here. And lo and behold, there's my castle group sitting right in the back there. So using a 2D GC time-of-flight mass spec, I'm able to pull away those interferences because it has the resolution power to pull away compounds, natural interferences, where the target compounds are still present. So we can run all the samples that I would have interferences with and be able to identify whether there's accelerant there or not. So the analytical chemistry can help, which is good news, because then I wouldn't have a job if that was the case. So this is a 2D GC time-of-flight mass spec of gasoline. Wow, eh? It's contour plot showing all the different molecules. We said there's about 300 to 500 different molecules in here. We look at generally those 12 when we're doing conventional analysis, looking for those patterns to see if they're there or not. They're there in gasoline, as they should be. But we expanded it, and we actually measured, I sampled gasoline from all across the province, analyzed it for all the compounds in it, and found that they all had, with about 50% detection rate, about 153 common compounds. So instead of being stuck to just those 12, I'm using 153 markers of gasoline to say if there's gasoline in the sample or not. So that's pretty cool. And using that data, I was going to say, well, can we fingerprint the gasoline when I spike it on wood chips? I'm not doing a hard experiment here. I'm just spiking it to wood chips, the different gas stations, and then I'm analyzing the data and saying, can I fingerprint the gas station? Because wouldn't it be cool if the chemist not only could tell them if there's gasoline present, but tell them where the gasoline was bought from, right? That would be the ideal thing. Then I'd feel like CSI, right? Horatio just walked in the room. Yeah, don't have my glasses. So what this is summarizing that data. And we have 153 compounds in all those different gasolines, and we summarize the data using a principal component analysis, a PCA, and a hierarchical cluster analysis, an HCA. And it's 2 different statistical techniques that are taking all that data and variability and saying, trying to group like samples. And lo and behold, my samples are nicely grouping where our shells are all forming a nice little pocket here. That Safeway purchased its gasoline from Shell that week, which was good. Flying J is a subsidiary of Shell, so it had Shell gasoline. So all my Shell gasolines are nicely grouped. And on a PCA, when things group together, you know they're similar. And that's a good thing. So we can fingerprint Shell, which is different from the Petrocan, which is slightly different from the Esso. Using a separate statistical technique, hierarchical cluster analysis, we're seeing the same sort of grouping, where Shell is all nicely clustered together, our petrocans are together, and our Essos are together. There's a bit of an exception there. Esso, unfortunately, it's single proprietary. You can buy your gas from anybody. So if you run out of gasoline and Imperial is not supplying it nice enough, you can go buy from Shell if you wanted to. But that's the exception. That's only Esso that can do that. Whereas Petrocan and Shell, they only buy from their own refineries. So I can fingerprint the different gasolines without burning them. That's the first step. The next step is to apply it to an actual real-life case where we're going to look for the gasoline in the arson samples and then try to find the gas station in which it was purchased. So there was a fire that broke out, and they had us come out and take samples, and I said, I think we could find the gas station. They thought I was crazy, so they said no. A couple months later, I said, I think we could find the gas station, and they allowed me to go sample all the gas stations. So it was a bunch of consultants driving around in a truck, sort of pulling up to a gas station, and we needed like that much gas. So we got a weird look when you handed them like a loony. They're like, did you take any gas? Yeah. You know, there's a bit of spillage, but we tried not to. Anyway, so we went and sampled these 9 gas stations, because there's only 9 gas stations within 100 kilometers, and arsonists are generally pretty lazy. It's not like they, drive from Brooks all the way up to Grand Prairie and, had gasoline because they decided they were going to burn something. Usually it's a last-minute thing. They're like, yeah, I think I'm going to start a fire. They'll go to the gas station and buy some gas and then head out. So I wanted to see if I could give the RCMP a little bit more to go on. So we used those 153 marker compounds of gasoline, and we did these controlled burn tests in an extremely well-controlled environment called Quartz Garage. Burned them, analyzed them, and we have to look at 153 things and the variability of all those things in all those samples. So we had to use a statistical technique to do that. So this is a principal component analysis. So this is a matrix. We've run all the samples, we put all the data in, and I'm going to walk you through what the principal component analysis is telling us. And things that are grouping together are like. So the first thing we had to do is our gas station samples, spiking them to wood chips. Lo and behold, we get 2 different clusters of samples. We get these ones down here in the bottom, which is these 2 are actually the gas station we sampled 3 months apart. It's a Shell gas station. And then there's one other one, plus those other ones up there, which are sort of grouping higher up. So we had sort of 2 different clusters right from the start. So, that's not bad. If I was to hope, it's going to be these ones down here that they bought it from, not up there. So then we burnt some gasoline on some soil. So using those gasolines that we purchased, we spiked them onto soil and burned them, and you could see the pattern shift. And they're still grouping together, but they're moving. And this is using that Shell station, and that's, again, the same one, and then that, and that's sort of what we saw with the burning of the samples. They're starting to move across my PCA. So we added a log samples where, we spiked these logs, and we did some wood chip samples. So these little crosshairs are the wood chips. So we're adding different samples to see if we can see if the PCA can tell us where the fuel was purchased from. We also burned up to 4 minutes, right? I told you there was just this black carbon city thing, and they all went over here. Way over, they all moved over here. We could still see gasoline, but they all sort of got clumped together. So when you burn it too much, you lose your signal. So that's an important thing about trying to find the fingerprint of gasoline is you want it burnt, but you don't want it too burnt. It has to be just right. And that's kind of hard to find sometimes when you're in the fields. You have to get lucky sometimes. There. So PC1, principal component 1, was explaining a burn pattern or a burn process. Fresh gasoline. And as we progressively burn stuff, it starts to move across my principal component analysis to where it's extremely burned. So that's good. We know that it's describing something. So that's fresh versus burnt gasoline. So then we added some of the site data. When we added the site data, we started to fill in a little bit. So some of the samples were plotting with our extremely burnt wood chips. And then we had a couple here, site samples. They're starting to follow this nice trend. So we're setting up the trend of the gas stations. And lo and behold, we're starting to see a trend where that bottom sample seems to be the one that is where our gasoline was purchased. So there's our heavily burnt reference samples and our samples from our site. This happened to be the lucky charm. What happened is there was a log that was on the site, and it was just smelt like gasoline. It didn't burn very well. They had put gasoline on it, and you could physically smell it as you were walking by. So it wasn't too hard to say, yeah, I think there's something here. When we analyzed it, we found stuff too, so that was good. But it was also preserved our signal the most. And what we found is wood, when dead wood, trees that are down that have accelerant on them, when you burn them, the outside gets crispy, nice and coated. And it's sort of a protective carbonaceous layer that sort of gets in there. All the juices, just like when you're doing your steaks, nice and juicy inside. So the accelerant had penetrated the log. We had crisped the outside to preserve it. And when we cracked open that outside casing of carbon, we could smell the gasoline. And that's the signal that we're seeing here. So nice fresh gasoline was there. So we could prove with that log that we knew that the gas was being purchased from one of these stations here. One of these two. Remember, this is the sample that was from the same gas station. So we could tell the RCMP that it's one of those two gas stations where that gasoline was purchased, assuming they bought it within 100 kilometers of the fire. So that was kind of neat. They didn't think we could do that. And it's all because of using the latest analytical technology to help us with this problem of a 2D GC has that peak capacity where we can remove our interferences and have a clear pattern and see everything. Plus, it has very good detection limits, which are better than conventional arson analysis, about 100-fold better detection limits in most cases. And remember I asked you at the beginning a little bit about how complicated it can get. This is burnt wood chips, burnt for 4 minutes with gasoline present, and there's about 1,700 different compounds that we look for, or can look for, that are present in that sample. 153 of those are my target ones that we're looking for to say if there's gasoline present or not. So using that 2D GC, we were able to source the gasoline for that particular fire. We're starting to use this on a regular basis. It has to obviously be in a small enough area. If it's in a major metropolitan area, I'm not going to go sample all the gas stations in Calgary. Probably not going to be very good at tracing down the gas station. A little too much there. But small community fires, there's not very many gas stations, so we can generally point them in the right direction pretty quickly. And we were able to provide the investigators the gas stations to go to, and they were able to look at the receipts as well as look at video surveillance to try to figure out who bought the gasoline and help with the investigation. So the chemist was allowed to go just a little step further than what he had planned. And that's it. Hope you've enjoyed my talk, and if you have any questions, I'm all social media'd up too, so if anybody wants to Twitter or anything like that, I'm the guy. Joby doesn't tell me the highest concentration of gas. And that's the thing I had to convince the investigators of. When Joby's going out in the field, it's not like she's going, where is it a little bit more concentrated? I'm going to put my nose down, right? As soon as she gets to the edge, down, right? Puts her nose down. That doesn't mean that's the best place to sample. So there's this judgmental thing. As soon as you see that flag, you're going, okay, I got this area that it represents, and you have to subsample. And the more samples, the better. There's certain things you avoid. I don't sample really burnt material because it's carbon. It's going to retain the signal, and it's been severely burned, so there's not much there to start with, and that carbon's going to hold on to that accelerant, and I'm not going to be able to see it. So there is a bit of a subsampling thing there. The more samples to represent that particular area. I did a grid sample. The first time I was invited to sample when Joby was there, I actually did a grid, and I did every 30 centimeters to see, how accurate she was. And, I had a 3 meter by 3 meter area, and I get hits everywhere. So she just put her nose down once, but it represented a 3 meter by 3 meter area. So yeah, you do have to sample different things. You look for different signs, and I do have guidance for the investigators on what to sample and what not to sample. I work with a lab called Agate Laboratories, and I started a forensics lab that specializes in arson investigation. So yeah, I don't have my GC mass spec in my garage. My wife won't let me. I have asked. She likes her car to be warm when she gets up, and she doesn't want that 2D GC time of flight mass spec in there. there's a Bible, Arson Bible, that thou shalt follow this. And so it says I have to do that. We do a few more things. We clean the cans to make sure that they're clean so that we don't have that cross-contamination. We seal, we double seal them. We'll put them in plastic bags so that we can't, paint cans aren't the ideal sealing thing either, right? Like you can smell paint outside a paint can, or when you go in a paint store, you can smell paint. The reason is those paint cans are leaking. And so, yeah, we double bag them to try to preserve the VOCs and not have them crosstalk to each other. So we do a little bit extra. We're experimenting with different techniques. There's poly bags that you can buy, and you can seal them in the field. So there's you could vacuum seal essentially your evidence. It could be clear, you could see it. So there's some advantages of that, and I'm hoping to change the methodology locally and then start pushing it out internationally to say we maybe should do this a little different. But it's hard. They're staunch believers in what they've done in the last 20 years, and they don't want to change. There generally isn't a ta-da moment where you pop something in an instrument and you get the results and go, yes, I've got it. A little light goes on, ding, green, red. It doesn't work that way. Like, you know, you can imagine what I have to explain in a courtroom of, I go out in the field and I sample, and I have 48 hours of video of me sampling dirt, and I document how I transported it to the lab and how nobody tampered with it. And then the lab documents how they handled each and every sample. They took pictures and they ran it through the mass spec, and all the sample says it's the right sample that they analyzed, and then the data comes back, and then I look at it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then I put it in a statistical program, and then I run a principal component analysis on it, and then I develop this graph, and it tells me that there's presence. You know, that's a big explanation, right? So really it's about the process and documentation to show that you didn't screw up. And then they trust all the middle, and then it's a pretty picture at the end. I really think these pictures are the thing where I have a statistical method that says, here's sample A, here's sample B. They're different, right? And it's so easy to see. And trying to get that into a visual format that the judge and jury understand, but it's all defensible and it's all documented. So it's not as nice as CSI makes it out. And I tell people this too, when we're doing juries and stuff, they never ask questions about the carcinogenic effect of a molecule, or like, it never gets to that. It's always about, did you take the sample properly? And did it have legal chain of custody? Because that's what everybody is. They're not questioning the hard science. They want to find a gaping hole in the middle ground somewhere.